Hi, everyone. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Good morning. I am Parisa Izzat Panahi, Associate Professor in Architecture at Curtin University. I know you know, but because we have so many online people. So the convener of ArchiTalk series, which I've had the pleasure of running since 2019. Today, we mark the 40th ArchiTalk, and we are excited to co-host this special event with Emma here, with the Perth Urban Research Lab, led by Professor Francesco Mancini. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Emma Williamson, the Government Architect of Western Australia and Chair of the State Design Review Panel. Emma provides independent expert advice on significant projects and strategic planning to the state government, the Premier and the Minister of Planning. With nearly 30 years of experience as a practicing architect and business owner, Emma also holds degrees in architecture and interior architecture, interior design, and serves as an adjunct professor at Monash University. We are thrilled to have her here with us today. And Francesco, do you have a few welcoming notes as well? I know it's not expected, but I thought it would be nice to have a few words from you before inviting Emma on board. Thank you.
Thanks, Parisa. Just very quickly, I just want to remind that for us is also an important date. This is the 5th year that we run the Perth Urban Research Lab project that actually started in collaboration with the government architect when Jeff Warner was at the helm. And we started working with the Department of Planning and the Government Architect Office to implement the 10 principles of good design of the state planning policy 7.0 in our courses. So this has been a very successful story, and so we're very happy to continue the collaboration with the government architect, and we're very pleased to have Emma today with us. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of Western Australia. I pay my respects to ancestors and elders, both past and present, and the ongoing connection between people, land, waters, and community. I acknowledge those who continue to share knowledge, their traditions and culture to support our journey for reconciliation. In particular, I recognise land and cultural heritage as places that hold great significance for Aboriginal people. Well, hello. As I have been so warmly introduced, thank you very much for inviting me today. I've been in my role as government architect for 6 months, but I thought I'd just take a moment to very quickly talk about the 2 practices that I had started prior to this role. The first was what you would call a traditional practice, working across every scale from small projects to public buildings to urban design and master planning. It was a practice that I founded with my husband, Kieran Wong, when we finished university.
Emma, sorry to interrupt. I don't think your microphone works. They can't quite hear you. Let me just quickly unmute. Sorry.
Oh, that works.
Thank you.
Okay. It was a practice that I founded with my husband, Kieran Wong, and we started as soon as we finished university. The second practice was the Fulcrum Agency that we started around 6 years ago. It's what you would say a not so traditional practice, focusing primarily on master planning and issues of housing in remote and regional communities across Australia. So it has a large footprint in terms of where it works, but a very narrow focus. I was also the member and chair of numerous design review panels, including chair of the City of Stirling, City of Canning and City of Belmont. I believe that every building is a part of shaping the city, and the way that we do this reflects our values as a society. And I also think it sends a message to future generations about what we value and how we value them. I'm the 5th government architect since 2003 and consider myself very fortunate to have arrived at just the right time. For the last 4 years, the role has been full-time, located inside Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, DPLH. This strengthens the connections and collaborations between GAWA, which is Government Architect Western Australia, my world now, first time working in government, completely full of acronyms, and our planning colleagues, creating an opportunity to work to support the application of the State Planning Policy 7.0, Design in the Built Environment. Design review is a critical point of intersection with this policy, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. At GAWA, we are really driven by the idea and the reality of working collaboratively to create better places by design for everyone. We work as collaborators, but we are also very working in very nimble ways to make sure that we understand that the way that we can be most useful in the way that we are applying our strategic advice and assistance on projects. We understand that projects have a lot of complexity and a lot of competing forces. They operate in a particular time, in a particular context, and that all forms a part of the landscape in which we respond to projects. So right now, supporting the provision for social and affordable housing, addressing issues of sustainability, continuing to champion good design, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute, developing a designing with country framework, thinking about ways that we can empower innovation and impact positively the built environment through collaboration with industry are all priorities. Because I've come from many years in practice, I was saying to Francesca just before, I've found it difficult to not apply some of that thinking to the way I've come into this role. And the range of services, if you like, that we provide, we've started to try and identify in terms of where the life of a project. And you can see that where we feel that we can contribute a lot is in the early stages of a project, because that's often where you can get the most value from early strategic advice. But before I start, I want to get some stereotypes out into the open, because it's something that I've come to realise when I arrive on the scene, being called an architect. You know, I'd like to think that in some ways the stereotypes of architects is shifting, but I don't think it necessarily has shifted as much as I thought. And there's still this idea of the hero, the person who wants to be seen as the principal author or conceiver of an idea. But there's also programs like Grand Designs that mean that the stereotype of an architect who is really obsessed with the object, and it comes at the expense of others, if you like. So cost blowouts, time blowouts, unnecessary complexity. And if I think of this and then I walk into a situation of trying to sell the idea of good design, I need to address that and speak to that in order to be able to describe what it is that I mean by good design. So, what is it that we mean by good design? I would say that it's not about shiny materials or stone-clad foyers. It's not about how something looks or whether it's fashionable. It's not about trying to win an award. It does not have to be expensive. It is not a matter of opinion, nor is it a matter of taste. Good design is the capacity to take the complexity that exists in every project and synthesize this into simple, a simple and cohesive response. Good design is about dealing with multiple issues at the same time, and it is not a choice between one or the other. Good design is objective, and it is also measurable. And we have a lot to be thankful for in WA. We have a planning policy that defines good design and takes the emotion out of it. It means that we can all get on with the business of addressing the challenges that we face collectively, leaving a legacy for future generations that we can be proud of. I never thought I would be quoting a planning policy, but here you go. Good design reconciles multiple concurrent and often competing objectives and outcomes that vary according to the circumstances of each project, of each site and project. So these 10 principles are my 10 commandments. It's a move away from the quantitative assessment toward qualitative metrics. It's a move away from black and white toward the opportunity that exists in the grey. And it has finally brought planners and architects together in the most logical of ways. And this policy has managed to take complexity and make it simple. The suite of policy documents set out the objectives and principles and create a framework for assessing projects. And as a tool, it should be used during the design process for better outcomes at every stage and not just at the end when it's being assessed. All of the principles are important, but they are also interconnected. But it does not mean that they are weighted evenly for every project. For example, a social and affordable housing project would place greater emphasis on safety because that's a key consideration for the resident cohort. Functionality and build quality are also essential because the running costs and durability and the reduction of ongoing expenditure are critical to the financial model. Whereas a museum in a heritage precinct might place greater emphasis on the understanding and response to the context, the impact of bulk and scale, and what is being offered to the community as a public asset. These policies and principles guide design generally and also form the basis of our assessment for a project. And as a result of the shift from quantitative, that is the tick or the cross, right or wrong, to the qualitative, is this a good outcome, design review has become a central component of assessing design in the built environment. It is the moment where planners and other built environment experts come together, and it's design review that I want to focus on. So, what is design review? It's the process of independently evaluating the design quality of a development. It's carried out by a panel of expert multidisciplinary built environment professionals. Central to the success of design review is respect for these protocols. And it's a foundational idea of design review that the proponent team is supported in meeting the expectations of SPP 7 through an iterative process of advice given by expert panel members and the opportunity for the proponent team to reflect and respond. If a project meets the threshold for design review, it will typically take 2 or 3 reviews, but there are other ways to interact with the review process. In early reviews, the advice is offered to the proponent team for consideration and response. And in the final review, a piece of advice is provided to the assessing officers, and it's always ordered against the 10 principles. It's one of many pieces of advice that are considered in a planning application. So it is not an approvals mechanism, it's a piece of advice. So is design review doing what it was envisaged when it was established? And at the risk of sounding like I'm turning into a politician, I would say the answer is both yes and no. It's important to consider the state of play before this suite of policies was developed, so that we can just remember where it is that we've come from. And without wanting to bring the tone down too much, I'll share these with you because this was the sort of development that was proliferating. And if we think about some of the principles of good design, which I have to say is the way that I seem to look at everything these days, I can see a response to context and character that is wanting, a very limited respect for a contribution to the community and the streetscape, limited amenity through high-level windows that look like they'd be to habitable rooms, a predominance of car parks and vehicles above pedestrians, limited landscape and the amenity that they provide, and so on and so forth. And then if we look at what was happening in some of the plans, and this is some of the early research work that was prepared by the OGA previously, to start to make a case for why such a policy could be of value, we were starting to see apartment building after apartment building with bedrooms that were actually completely internal, had no access to natural light or ventilation. In other instances, light wells, which were very narrow and up to 5 stories deep, also as the primary source of light and ventilation, if in fact it could be received. And actually, evidence later demonstrated that often these light wells were covered over because they were difficult to manage and maintain. So even worse. Really long, 60 or 70 metre corridors with limited legibility and questionable safety, no address, in boardrooms, again and again with limited landscaping, balconies that aren't functional or providing any amenity, bedrooms that are in the rear of the apartment buildings. And then if we look at what was happening in regards to the impact of infill and the loss of trees in people's gardens over that time as a result of responses to, insensitive responses to the opportunities that would exist. And if we look just very briefly at what that might look like a little bit closer, it's a sizable lot which is almost completely covered in building mass, and you can see if you look at the neighbouring sites that what we would assume would have had some tree canopy is no longer existing. But it hasn't all been a disaster, and this publication, which was released earlier this year but also conceived and worked on prior to my appointment, really laid out and established some excellent case studies that exist within the Perth metropolitan area around projects that have been done well. And this is available online if you're interested in looking at it or haven't seen it already. And this project in Shenton Park is one such example of a case study that starts to respond immediately. You can see that the use of the pitched roof, which corresponds with the neighbouring sites, the kind of transparency and interface with the street, this even in this small shot, idea of landscape being connected to the dwelling, these large openings but quite modestly sized spaces behind, and a respect for the existing landscape of the site. And there it is sitting on the rear of that corner block. So really taking advantage of the assets that exist in a place and responding to those and building on those to build future character. So I think the biggest challenge with design review, if we go back to design review now, is that there's been a misalignment in the way that it was intended and the way that it is often used. So rather than seeing it as a constructive process that supports proponents to meet this threshold of good design, it's often seen as a hoop to jump through. And I want to unpack this a bit more, because I think if we collectively see value in review, we can better serve our clients and our community. moving a step closer to achieving good outcomes that improve the urban environment, benefit local communities, and leave a positive legacy for future generations. Another quote from the planning policy. It's just full of beautiful pieces. So number one is timing, and there's no question in my mind that timing is the biggest issue. When we engage in review, underpins the capacity for the process to add value to a project. We know that the first moves can be the most important when the design is flexible and improvements can be incorporated without impact to budget and time. If a project comes in for a review at the point where it is being lodged, the consultant team has already spent all of its time and its money. There is not the capacity to take on the feedback of the panel. Things have been finalised to the point where what is intended as constructive feedback lands as criticism. Engaging with review early creates an opportunity to discuss the big moves and determine how the attributes of a site can be used to a project's advantage. So many of the context, build form, sustainability and amenity aspects of a project can be addressed by testing these first moves and getting the approach right. Design is not just about the object. Really important design decisions are being made way earlier. It all starts with the planning. When the subdivision considers orientation, the precinct structure plan considers community amenity or the retention of significant landscape, the capacity for a good outcome is far greater. And it's also vital to have a good project brief that adequately captures both the function and the aspiration of a project, that marries this against the budget that is realistic for these goals and doesn't forget an allowance for landscape and public realm. Design is a balancing act. A proposal does not just respond to the physical place that it's in, it also responds to the broader social, economic and environmental context that it is in, as well as anticipating the future. The constraints of the budget and the urgency for delivery form part of this balancing act, and a skilled team can work to achieve these outcomes without sacrificing good design. Good design is the capacity to balance these things well. It takes a village of consultants to raise a building. If you know that a project is going to need to go through review, you need to make sure that your consultant team, and especially your architect or you as the architect, has the capacity to listen to advice and not make it about their or your ego. Everyone should be working together for the best possible outcome. Projects like this one are not the result of a single hand, but the capacity to understand the brief and the context, as well as the willingness of the consultant team to work together, valuing both the expertise and the richness that comes from a collaboration. The 10 principles create a framework to measure good design, and these principles are interconnected. What benefits one will often be felt in another. Using these principles to discuss a project as it is developing helps to create a common language across disciplines. In this housing project in Melbourne, affordability for homeowners was prioritised along the creation of community and sustainability. By creating a communal laundry on the rooftop, each apartment was able to have a smaller footprint, saving money, and the laundry became a focal point of social connection for the community of residents. Different project scales require different things from review, and different project scales may respond differently to some of the principles. A good example of this is sustainability. While larger projects may reasonably be expected to demonstrate their sustainabilities against a certified methodology, this would be considered too onerous for smaller projects. Demonstrating a considered response to site orientation through passive solar design for shading summer sun and solar access in winter alongside natural ventilation are important for every project. and being clear about commitments to specific measures such as solar PV, sustainable building materials, and a connection to the natural landscape should be made explicit. There's sometimes a disconnect between what is intended as constructive feedback and how it is being received as criticism. And I think there's two reasons for this. The first is that many people are not familiar with critique and are used to presenting work for approval. And as architecture students and architects, I think that this is something, I still remember that process as a student, that very difficult process of realising it wasn't about me, it was about the work and it was about making it better. And that is not commonplace. That is not how the rest of most people interact. They are used to coming in and presenting work that's finished and complete for approval. So if critique is adding value through questioning and challenging a project, we need to make sure that people understand that. It is an opportunity for an external expert set of eyes to have a fresh look at a project and become the best version of itself. It's not a matter of right or wrong, it's not a matter of good or bad, and it's not personal, as I said. The second and possibly more significant reason I think that there is this disconnect, although I do think that they are interconnected, is that very often we're seeing projects coming into review that are progressed to a point where there's no time or money left to respond. So it just isn't that constructive because it's done and dusted. Have I done something wrong? No, that was it. So that was supposed to be on that slide. Okay, got it. So we're moving here. So being curious about a project and testing for failure is an important part of critique and the review process more broadly. I think of this as testing for failure and doing this to expose issues that can be dealt with early and before costs are added to a project. This could be the capacity for a project to adapt over time or consideration of how a proposal will form part of a future context. It can also take the form of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. For example, you could intently consider the experience of a pedestrian as you are designing the layout of a shopping centre. Are there any safety issues? Are the entries legible? And is the experience made enjoyable as a result of the amenity that you have been able to add through the landscape? Design review panels only ever give advice and never instruction. Projects of every scale are complex. You only have to think about the concealed networks of pipes that are required to move water around a building to know that there is a lot going on behind the scenes. Providing instruction on one aspect of a design, it carries extreme risk in not understanding the intersection of this with other critical factors. It's for the expertise of the project team to consider the advice and respond based on their in-depth understanding. Panels look to support projects that seek discretion by understanding the rationale for an approach and the range of approaches that have been tested by the team. Advice will focus on key issues that are particular to that project. For example, the interface with heritage buildings, the activation of the ground floor, and the way that sustainability has been integrated in this project were examples. And I'm going to come back to this project as a case study in a little bit. We often talk about collaboration in design review, and I think that this can sometimes be misunderstood as designing together. Because of each project's complexity and the deep knowledge that the consultant team has, the panel's role as collaborators is to maintain a respectful, engaged curiosity. I think of this as a conversation between the proponent team and the panel. Everyone is invested in the best possible outcome, and it is possible to manage complexity in delivery and respond to the issues that have been raised. And again, this is a project that came through State Design Review Panel before my appointment, and certainly has been often cited as a very collaborative, productive interaction. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Perth Girls' School as an example of a project. This came through State Design Review Panel at a time when I was on the panel and asked to be chair, so I did actually interact with this project. It had an extensive project team who I believe from my interaction with them looked to be working very well and collaboratively together. And I want to talk a little bit about the presentation that they came into in design review and the tactics that they took. There's a bit of a double up on some of these slides, and this is them, but we'll whip through some of them. The proposal is for 744 apartments built to rent with some hospitality and supermarket and event spaces. So you can see, and I think for the students who are here today, look, I think that the kind of importance of being able to simplify and use diagrams to explain complexity is so vital. And it's not just how you interface with design review, it's in every single aspect of describing the value that you are bringing to a project. You need to be able to work out how to do that using this incredible language of drawing that you have. So in these, you can see, and again, I might be a little bit more relevant later on, but this way that the small, so I just said there's 744 apartments. This slide is talking about the very small pieces of offerings, this idea of hinting toward how a neighbourhood and community is being made through this process. And importantly, this history, which is ancient, which is colonial, which is current, which is future, and starting to build up a narrative in the presentation. Locating the project in its broader context so that we can see its connection to green spaces is importantly, but also to the city more generally. Looking more closely at that in terms of the network of transport, the interconnectedness of this with other parts of the city, and then starting to create a discussion around the way that the project proposal offers something better than what was imagined. So this is the project showing just very broadly the massing as outlined in the design guidelines, and then talking about how, where the project team saw opportunities to create even better quality to achieve this idea of good design and, in this case, also excellence. So putting this supermarket underground, so really privileging the idea of landscape and the amenity that is brought in because of that. And starting to create simple ways that we can understand the complexity of such a big project. So this movement between culture and convenience, what's at the front of house, what's at the back of house, and ways that people move through. So really simplifying, but you can't simplify an idea that isn't resolved, that doesn't have, in a sense, it hasn't distilled complexity into simplicity. You can't diagram that. You need it to become simple so that you can make the diagram. And I think that this is one of the strengths of this proposal and also the presentation. It combines also more technical drawings to allow us to understand the interrelationship and the relationship, importantly, to the site. It gives us small pieces of technical information like site levels, but it's not a drawing that looks as though it's going to be submitted for a DA. It's still a conversation. And then starts to talk about how the heritage project, and these are snippets of this. I'm not showing you the whole thing. That would take another whole hour. But the way that the response to the heritage building has been reactivated, this site was used for several years by ArtRage, and so the idea was that they would come back into the space. So that question then raised, how do you manage the kind of noise and ambition of that with all of these residences? So that was something that became part of the review process. They're very clear in the opportunity of the heritage buildings, and also the cues and clues that were starting to form a part of their toolbox, if you like, in terms of the way that they might respond and talk about what it was to respond and add to this context. And this drawing, I think, is something that is very reminiscent of something that you might see in a university, a design submission, and very powerful and useful because it sets up a logic for a material and colour response so that people can understand it and understand the way that this is adding to the this overall precinct. It isn't, for me, the measure is always, if this was, I don't know, on the beach in Cottesloe, would it be the same? And I think, no, this felt like it was responding to its place. So this is a repeat of those earlier slides, which again show you those smaller, more fine-grained activations and pieces of amenity, as well as those larger pieces in terms of what is, the ArtRage, the bigger kind of pieces of creative infrastructure, and then what that looks like to have those apartment buildings over the top. So all of this is very diagrammatic. It's building up a narrative that is helping us to understand the approach that has been taken, as well as the comfort that the buildings will work, so that there is a logic to the way that they are planned, that there is amenity being provided to each of the apartments that is consistent with what we would expect out of the SPP7 suite of documents, as well as some renders. So this is in Design Review 1, most of these renders, and I've got a couple that show some of the changes that were made between a few of the design reviews. So again, you can see that this is obviously a big gear shift for this part of the city, but it is being done in response to the context, and it is absolutely maintaining the kind of priority around the amenity provided through landscape, as well as that response to the heritage buildings. And as a result of having multiple hands on one project, there's differences in the language of the buildings, which also, I think, really adds something to the development of a neighbourhood context. And I very quickly wanted to just talk about the importance of the landscape here. It was doing a lot of work, and it also has a context, and I think it's important to integrate those things from the very beginning. And the landscape architects also went through and talked about the opportunities that they saw, the connections that they felt were important, and allowed the panel opportunities to discuss that in terms of the complex interrelationships of residents and the general public, people shopping, people entertaining, and the role that landscape plays in both amenity, legibility, and that interface with the community and the invitation to the public. Deep soil is often an issue, as basement parking and so forth start to limit opportunities for that. So an important part of the conversation was to recognise that those opportunities and how they have been realised, as well as that interface with the existing streets and the technicalities you know, it's not a pipe dream. There's rigor, but there's also the opportunity to have some conversations. And these are just a couple of the slides that all of the drawings that I've shown you were prepared by the proponent team. So I didn't prepare this, but this was some in between design review 2 and 3. This is the response to feedback that they were given around the I think scale of the entry, which you would see on the right-hand side of the building. It was a resident lobby, and the feedback from the panel was whether or not that was an appropriate scale for a residential entry, or whether there would be a benefit in somehow addressing that to make it feel less like an office building and more like a residence, as well as ways to increase the kind of, I guess, the warmth of that, the invitation for that. So very subtle changes, which I think are significant. The coloured underside of the slab for that podium, the increase in that canopy, and so forth. As well as these subtle changes here, feedback again from the panel around the activation onto the street and the address, and whether or not sufficient amenity and generosity was being contributed back to the community at that streetscape, and how that affected the legibility of this brewery. So an increase, a substantial increase in the extent of the landscape, and also a subtle change in the selection of the brick colour, which was felt to be more appropriate to their original contextual analysis. And then feedback on things like the level of amenity and resolution of things like the communal spaces for apartments. This is some of the work talking about those small scale interventions that start to create a more human ground plane. That brewery. And this, I'll just finish on this slide and just say that I do honestly really believe in the SPP7 suite of documents, their capacity to bring value to the built environment and the role that design review plays. And I think that it is possible for us to keep emphasising the importance of early engagement in our interactions and our collaborations, because I think that it's easy to see the potential for pairing the depth of understanding that a design team has for a project with that they have with the project, the brief and the budget, with this external expert set of eyes that are really curious collaborators who are coming to support the best possible outcome for the project. And I think that if we can work on this, we can work on getting our timing right, we can really see the application of those principles and their benefit across our built environment everywhere that we turn. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. It was absolutely brilliant. I guess, of course, very beneficial for everyone, but specifically for our students. I think early engagement with all the processes will definitely help you guys to be a bit more open and receptive in your very near future when you start your practice. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Any question from anyone?
Maybe I can start.
Yes, Francesco. I might bring the microphone to you, because otherwise online people cannot hear.
I have a big voice, so maybe I can just.
You would need to go too close to laptop, otherwise they wouldn't hear.
I will show in the ears of anyone.
Also, if anyone else has a question, I can always repeat it into here.
Okay.
So that people who are maybe online.
So first of all, thank you for the exemplar presentation in terms of content and communication. That was great, a great lesson. and I think that you convey the value that is behind this whole operation. My question to you is expanding even further. We have seen that all the government architects now have built a network, and they're trying to share knowledge and experience to increase the quality of the built environment through this approach to policy. So there have been initiatives. This is not the first time that happens in Australia. Victoria started, if I'm not mistaken, and then we follow. And I think that Western Australia is really leading the way at this moment in terms of the quality we are delivering with very important projects delivered in Perth over the past 5 to 10 years. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the work that you are doing with all the government architects at this stage? You're exchanging information, you are trying to see how to move forward, how to have more impact. If you could speak a bit more about that.
So another acronym, GARNA, that's the Government Architects Network Australia. So that is a very, that's a long established network. I think it's actually 20 years because I went to the meeting in May and it was the 20th celebration. So some of the old government architects came as well. So that was good. And that is an incredible resource and has complete generosity across jurisdictions. So what the role of the government architect state by state is not exactly the same, and the size of the office is not the same, where it sits in government is not the same. In this moment, social and affordable housing is the same. That is but the approach has been different across states.
Yeah.
And so that's been terrific. So that has meant that I've been able to connect in with the government architect in Queensland. They have had a modern methods of construction. They had a competition. They actually, within the Queensland government, still have they still deliver projects in part. We're able to connect. But I was able to then ask them to give a presentation to people that I'd invited across the government in Western Australia to start to talk about that experience. Anything that I have wanted to know, any question that I would have, I can just get into that. There's shared resources, but there's also bi-monthly meetings, and then at what's called an officer level, there's streams. So we have infrastructure, a GARNA infrastructure team network, a housing network, and a design review network. And those networks catch up, I think maybe monthly or bi-monthly, and also speak then specifically about projects. So that relationship has been fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I borrow the microphone because there's one online?
I don't think this is working
Oh, it
yet.
doesn't work?
I think.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. One question online from UK. What should we do if we receive 2 different critiques for our proposal on how we should move forward with the project?
So if I assume that this person has asked this from a professional practice point of view,
I think so, yeah.
I think the role of design review, and in particular the role of the chair in design review, is to be able to provide advice to the proponent that is clear and not confusing. So it hasn't been my experience that proponents get 2 conflicting pieces of advice. In the design review, I'm not discounting this, but I want to just explain what the experience is of design review. Is in design review, there's a period of time before the proponent team comes in, which is we refer to as the caucusing, and it's a time to discuss the key issues that each of the panel members has observed during their own assessment of a project, and discuss how that might intersect. So there may be somebody who's a sustainability expert, a landscape architect, an architect, and a traffic person, let's say. And they come with their own expertise, and sometimes, rarely, there'll be conflicting. And in that moment before the review is an opportunity to discuss that. certainly when the notes from the meeting come back, there should be one thing. It shouldn't be, have you thought about blue? Have you thought about yellow? That would be confusing. So I think that the other, I guess, piece of advice I would have around conflicting ideas, and perhaps this is also the case sometimes with students, I don't know if this is the case, but you might like present your work to somebody and then the next time you present it to a different tutor and they have like a slightly different angle and you think, oh jeepers, but they told me to go down that path, you know. And I think that's actually not quite, it actually goes to the core of advice and review, which is that the process, that process is really an invitation for you to consider it. And if somebody, a piece of advice in review or in creche or whatever, you can go away and look at it, but you're absolutely entitled to come back and say, well, I tested it, that didn't work, or there were all these other factors that didn't work. And if you come back and there's a second person who's got a slightly different angle, which is the same, because if you had a brief and you gave it to 1,000 people, you get 1,000 different designs. So that's the fantastic thing. Well, good, but it shouldn't be their opinion. It's not the matter of taste or style. It should come from a place. So if a person's giving you conflicting advice, it's like, well, where's that coming from?
So I think this is super important for our students. You had a slide said, good design is not I think. When you refer to why, so there is research that is somehow testing, even through design. Design is also research in that sense. But if there is an hypothesis that is made at a certain point in the project, the student, the better to discuss what are all the implications. But then the proponent has the opportunity to dive deep and do further research and then say, well, I tested it. And maybe this is the best way to respond to the opponent. So they might take on board that there is an issue that can be resolved for better outcomes. But the pathway to that solution can be recognized and justified and supported by facts that actually lead to a slightly different proposition. Mm. Is that how it works?
Yeah, yes. And I think that as you were speaking, I was thinking maybe it's difficult because on the one hand, as if I just speak as an architect, you know, you can fall in love with your idea and become attached to it. But and so this idea of change, you sort of want to hold on to it. But actually, if you can say, what I want, what I love is for this thing to be the best version of itself. And here, like, are all these people in the village who are helping me be, you know, for this to become the best version of itself it can be, then you don't cling to what it looks like. You actually are more focused on what it is, how it is meeting these principles of good design. I mean, this is the interesting thing. And I was in a chair review yesterday and had the client, the developer, you know, all of the people in the team. And we got to this point at the beginning and we said, someone said, we didn't talk about the aesthetics in caucusing. And I turned to the client, I said to them, you'd be interested to know that we actually don't spend very much time at all talking about what a project looks like. It is all of these other things, and what it looks like comes out of that. And of course, we bring our own language and creativity to that, and that is important. But it is possible to arrive there in lots of different ways. And architecture must be much more than what it looks like. So we need to have a robustness, personal robustness to taking on that opportunity for improvement, I think.
Can I? Oh gosh, that's loud. Hello.
Hello.
That was really fascinating. Just going back to the slide you showed about critique, constructive versus destructive, but also entering into that space of what does it look like? Because what does it look like was a very major thing in the space I came from, working and training in London. And we didn't tend to accept that there was some kind of project that justified anything whatsoever, as long as it somehow was neutral. And that question of taste or style was something that was very much in the media, in the architectural media. AR still does a page of outrage, attacking architects' projects and saying how awful they are, not necessarily just from functional or programmatic reasons, but also from aesthetic reasons. And yet, when I moved to Australia, I was very quickly made aware that it was possible to sue people for having negative views on buildings or developments. So how do you think that sort of very sort of, it could be articulated as a very kind of a distaste with not destructive, but constructive, but aesthetic and stylistic criticism of developments in their context quite often doesn't seem to happen here, except behind closed doors?
So I think that the key, like the little unlocking, is context. So this context and character principle, I think, is the unlocking of being able to talk to what it is that you're doing. And even just looking here, I studied architecture here in Building 201, which is a beautiful piece of Brucianism, along with a suite of other buildings that were built on this campus at a time that had minimal landscape, few buildings, and over time the landscape has completely changed, and our capacity to enjoy that, as well as an evolution of the language of the buildings, which I think actually is probably well captured in this as I'm looking out of this little laneway, where there is a clear reference to that material palette and the incorporation of others. It feels like a step forward, but another set of architects could have a completely different response, which could also be completely appropriate. And so I don't have any. I think the reason that I would say that I would spend less time talking about aesthetics is it's the last thing you talk about once the other things are kind of sorted. It's starting to take care of itself. I sort of hope that by going through those things, you can satisfactorily demonstrate an outcome that's robust enough that it doesn't need to be wanting to be published on the back page outrage section. But there are terrible projects that are built. There is no question. And so I think that that's where we need to we need to use our agency to continue to improve the environment and to celebrate where those things are done well and the value of those things, because I think it is ultimately a question of value, and that isn't just the value right in this moment, it's the value in the next decade and the ones afterwards. So I think
that's the thing with students, which we find in both undergraduate and postgraduate, is trying to enable conversations that allow them to have informed critique at those levels of aesthetic and style as well as the programmatic, so that they can actually come to a point of having greater agency of saying this is the kind of thing that is bad as architecture, and therefore I can now sort of situate that within my own sort of sensorium about how I critique.
Yeah, but it's also completely okay to have a personal style.
Yeah.
Like I think that that buildings don't come out as just like a set of ingredients. Like every architect who's a design architect, and I think architects have very many skills and not everyone is a designer, like that you should, like, that's fantastic. What a gift.
Yeah.
There's a question just behind Francesca.
Oh.
Hello.
Hello.
I had a doubt regarding, you saw a picture of the ECU campus. So the facade was predominantly glass facades. So in a climatic condition like Perth, how do you deal with the thermal comfortability inside? And the facade had some protrude, I don't know what was that, some facade was protruding out as well. So is it like a shading device?
I believe that those facades they do have blades which are shading. I wasn't involved in the review of that project, so I don't feel like I have probably enough experience. But I do sometimes also wonder the same thing when you see, you know, large buildings in the city and their capacity to respond to that. But I also am not a facade expert, so sorry, I can't help really with that in too much detail.
Thank you.
No other question or question?
Yeah, we have only 1 minute left. If anyone else has any question, we can take the last.
Otherwise, I would just like to have Hannah commenting on the notion of complexity a bit further. I think that is a very important point that it made, that the complexity is already inherent in the problem we face. And one of the principles of the policy that you have highlighted is that the good design is making the response simple so the project can perform more than one level and respond to that complexity rather than looking for a complex response in formal terms or in programmatic terms or in many other ways. If you could elaborate a little bit more.
I think that there's two things. One is that I think that it's important to recognise that design, like this design thinking, like lots of people use the words for the skills that we have as architects and people love it, but somehow architects are not always great at being able to describe it for themselves. So design thinking, that is actually problem solving. That's what we do. So every time there is a brief for a building, which is on a site, which has a budget, which all of these, which is in a particular social, economic, political, environmental context, all of those things are complex and they need to be synthesized. And we have such special skills in doing that. And I think that the complexity, I guess, and this capacity to go in, for example, you are asked to design a recreation centre, but you've never done that before. You have to become an expert. You have to be curious. You have to go right in and find out. They've come with a brief, but is it the right brief? You need to test it. You need, there's all, and things get bigger and bigger and unwieldy, and architects love that. But there are lots of other professions where that is just scary. So this capacity to hold complexity and then say, it's okay, we're going to just work with this, and using this process of design thinking, we're going to be able to synthesize and bring together complexity to make it into something which is adding value. That is the special skill. And so I think for me, complexity is actually the opportunity. And I think the role that architects can play is in just making people feel comfortable with a little bit of complexity, and also making sure that we always advocate to say that it is not a matter of one thing or another. It can be both things. So how do we do it? And sometimes, you test options. I think this openness, this idea of testing, no, that doesn't work, here's another option, here's another, and trying to synthesize is really, for me, that's the magic.
Thanks.
All right, please join me in thanking Emma.
Thank you.